As of this week, wildfires have burned more than 5,200,000 acres across the United States this year, and it is only the first week of August. That number alone would be alarming in isolation. But here's what actually makes it significant. It already matches and slightly exceeds the total acreage that burned across the entire United States during all of 2025, a full 12-month season, and it did so with roughly 2 more months of peak fire activity still ahead on the calendar. 102 large wildfires are burning simultaneously across 15 states right now. The National Interagency Fire Center has held the country at its highest possible national preparedness level, level 5, since the middle of July, a designation rarely issued this early in a fire season. Today, we are going to break down exactly how the United States reached this point, which states are actually driving these numbers, and why. Officials are treating this season as something genuinely different from a typical bad year, using only confirmed data from federal fire agencies, not speculation. If tracking the real scale of this fire season, not just the headlines out of any single state, is something you want to keep doing, subscribing means you catch every update the moment new numbers come in. Let's start with the number itself, because understanding exactly how far above normal it sits is the key to understanding why officials are this concerned. According to the National Interagency Fire Center, the country had burned nearly 5.2 million acres as of August 3rd, a total well above the 10-year year-to-date average of roughly 3.8 million acres for the same point in the calendar, meaning this season is running close to 40% ahead of what the last decade would consider typical. To put that in even sharper context, the entire 2025 wildfire season across the United States, tracked from January through December, ultimately burned a little over 5 million acres total. This year matched that entire 12-month figure in barely 7 months, with August, historically one of the 2 most active months of the American fire season alongside September, only just beginning. The broader historical trend makes the comparison even more striking. Since the year 2000, the United States has burned an average of 7 million acres annually, more than double the 3.3 million acre average recorded during the 1990s. If 2026 continues accelerating at anything close to its current pace through the rest of the traditional peak season, this year is positioned to challenge some of the most severe fire seasons recorded in the past quarter century. That kind of acceleration is not simply a matter of extrapolating a straight line forward either, since fire seasons rarely burn at a steady, predictable pace. The bulk of any given year's total acreage typically accumulates during a handful of explosive growth periods when a specific combination of heat, wind, and low humidity aligns over already dry fuel and allows individual fires to expand by tens of thousands of acres within a matter of days. Washington's Sinlahekin fire, for example, more than doubled in size within a single 48-hour window once the right wind conditions arrived in late July. Multiply that kind of individual fire behavior across the more than 100 large incidents currently burning nationwide, and it becomes clear why. Officials are far more concerned with the underlying weather pattern driving this season than with the current acreage total in isolation, since a handful of additional explosive growth events spread across just a few more fires could add millions of acres to the national total within weeks rather than months, especially with the traditionally most active stretch of the calendar still ahead. The scale of the current response reflects exactly how seriously federal agencies are treating this moment. On July 18th, the National Interagency Fire Center raised the country's national preparedness level to 5, the highest tier that exists in the nation's wildfire response system. That designation is not issued lightly, and it is genuinely unusual to see it declared this early in the season, since level 5 is generally reserved for the point in a fire year when available firefighting. Resources, personnel, aircraft, and specialized incident management teams are stretched thin enough nationally that competing fires across multiple states are forced to compete directly for the same limited pool of support. As of the most recent count, 102 large wildfires were burning simultaneously across 15 different states, a number that explains exactly why the top-tier designation has remained in place for weeks rather than the days it might typically last during a more ordinary season. The preparedness level system itself runs on a simple 1 through 5 scale, with each level reflecting how much of the nation's shared firefighting capacity is currently committed. Lower levels mean individual regions can generally handle their own fire activity using local and regional resources, calling in outside help only occasionally. As the level climbs, it signals that more and more of the country's available crews, aircraft, and incident management teams are already deployed, leaving progressively less uncommitted capacity in reserve for whatever ignites next. Level 5 represents the top of that scale, a formal acknowledgement that national firefighting resources are stretched about as thin as the system is designed to handle, a condition that historically tends to appear for a concentrated stretch during the most severe weeks of an unusually active season, not as a routine, weeks-long fixture this early in the summer. Now, let's walk through where this acreage is actually concentrated. because the national total, as large as it is, obscures just how unevenly this season has hit different parts of the country. Oregon currently sits at the center of the crisis, with 33 major wildfires burning across the state, and a total that has already pushed past its own modern-era record for a single fire season, a mark that had only been set 2 years earlier in 2024. Officials there have been blunt that this record was broken, with a significant stretch of the traditional fire season still remaining, meaning the state's final total is expected to climb considerably further before conditions finally ease. Washington state has become the site of this season's single most destructive urban wildfire disaster, the Spokane area fires, which tore directly through residential neighborhoods inside the city itself, ultimately destroying more than 700 structures and forcing as many as 67,000 residents to evacuate, now widely described as the worst natural disaster in Spokane's recorded history. That disaster unfolded alongside a broader statewide emergency, with fires like the Kaiser Canyon blaze on the Colville Reservation, the Sinlahekin fire near Tonasket, each burning well past 100,000 acres, the Sinlahekin fire in particular remaining almost entirely uncontained for more than 2 weeks despite its size. What made Spokane's disaster specifically unusual, according to fire ecology experts who studied the event, was not any single ingredient in isolation, but the fact that hot, dry, windy conditions, available fuel, and an ignition source all converged directly next to a major urban area rather than remote forest or rangeland. That convergence produced a fast-moving wildfire capable of throwing embers well ahead of its own front line, igniting structure fires across entire residential blocks simultaneously rather than advancing along a single, trackable perimeter the way a typical wildland fire does. It is a distinction that helps explain why a fire covering a comparatively modest total acreage was still able to destroy more than 700 individual homes and businesses in a matter of days. Further south, Colorado and Utah absorbed some of the earliest, most severe activity of the entire season, including the loss of 3 firefighters battling the Knowles Fire along the shared state border at the end of June, a tragedy that struck during what should have still been the ramp-up phase of a typical fire year, rather than its most dangerous stretch. That timing detail carries real significance for how officials assess the overall trajectory of a season. Fire agencies typically expect their personnel, aircraft, and resource commitments to build gradually through the spring and early summer, reaching full seasonal capacity by the time August's traditionally higher risk conditions arrive. A fatal incident occurring in late June before that buildup was even complete is treated as a serious early warning sign that the season's danger curve has shifted earlier than the system was originally prepared for. Precisely the kind of signal that contributed to the National Interagency Fire Center raising the country to Preparedness Level 5 barely 3 weeks later. Understanding why the season has escalated this fast requires understanding the drought conditions sitting underneath nearly every one of these individual disasters. According to the U.S. Drought Monitor, more than a quarter of the total land area of the United States is currently experiencing severe drought or worse, and across the western half of the country specifically, that figure climbs to nearly half of all land area. Washington state entered this fire season in its 4th consecutive year of statewide drought emergency. Oregon issued its own statewide emergency declaration back in June, months before this season's record-breaking acreage total was even reached, citing record low snowpack as a driving factor. The connection between low snowpack and a severe fire season, while widely cited, is worth explaining directly, since it is not simply a matter of less overall precipitation falling during the preceding winter. Snowpack functions as a natural, slow-release water reservoir, storing moisture through the winter months and gradually feeding it into rivers, soil, and vegetation across spring and summer as it melts. When winter precipitation falls as rain instead of snow, a pattern tied directly to warmer winter temperatures, the gradual release disappears entirely. And the landscape dries out far earlier in the season than it otherwise would, even in years where total precipitation was not dramatically below average. Both Washington and Oregon experienced close to normal winter precipitation totals heading into this season, yet still entered summer with severely compromised snowpack, exactly the mechanism officials have pointed to when explaining why this year's fire risk escalated as fast as it did. Drought conditions like these do not cause a wildfire to ignite on their own. The overwhelming majority of fires still require an actual spark, whether from lightning or human activity, but they determine almost everything about what happens after that spark hits the ground, how dry the available fuel already is, how fast a fire can spread once it catches, and how much margin firefighting crews actually have before conditions turn genuinely explosive. Extreme heat has compounded that drought stress throughout the summer in a way that connects almost every region, driving this year's national total. Since late June, a rotating series of heat domes has moved across the country, each one trapping high temperatures in place for days or weeks at a stretch and drying out already stressed vegetation even further before the next wave arrived. By early August, that pattern had settled directly over the same stretch of the American West already fighting its worst fires, from Arizona up through Montana, threatening to push temperatures in cities like Las Vegas toward their all-time August records, while simultaneously priming even more fuel across the fire-affected region. What makes this particular summer's heat pattern so consequential for the national fire total is not any single heat wave in isolation, but the fact that it has repeated in overlapping waves since late June, rather than arriving once and clearing out. Each successive heat dome has landed on ground that had only partially recovered, if at all, from the previous one, meaning the cumulative drying effect on vegetation across the affected region has compounded rather than reset between events. That is precisely the kind of pattern fire behavior analysts say matters more than any single day's peak temperature, since a landscape that has been denied genuine recovery time between successive heat events enters each new hot. Windy stretch already primed closer to its breaking point than it would be following a more typical isolated summer heat wave. Fire officials have been direct about the underlying relationship connecting all of this together. Warming driven by the continued burning of coal, oil, and natural gas produces larger, more sustained heat waves, and those heat waves in turn deepen drought conditions and feed the kind of larger, faster-moving wildfires that have defined this specific season across so much of the country at once. It helps to understand exactly what it means, operationally, for the entire nation to be sitting at Preparedness Level 5 for this many consecutive weeks. The United States wildland firefighting system operates as a shared, coordinated national resource, meaning a hand crew, an aircraft, or a specialized incident management team is not simply assigned to a single state and left there for the rest of the season. It can be redirected wherever the greatest immediate need exists, based on real-time assessments of which fires pose the most serious threat to life and property. That system works well during a typical season, when major fires tend to peak in different regions at different points across the summer, allowing resources to shift as needed without every state needing maximum support simultaneously. This year's season broke that normal rotation almost entirely. In an ordinary year, a severe fire in the Pacific Northwest might peak in July while the Rocky Mountain states are still relatively quiet, allowing crews to shift west before later redeploying east as conditions there worsen in August or September. This year, Oregon, Washington, Colorado, and Utah all experienced severe headline-driving fire activity within roughly the same 6-week window, layered directly on top of more than a dozen other states, also managing significant incidents at the same time. That kind of simultaneous, multi-region severity is exactly what a Level 5 designation is meant to capture, a season where the usual strategy of shifting resources from a quieter region to a busier one no longer works, because there simply is no quieter region left to draw from. Level 5 means that system has run out of slack, with Oregon, Washington, Colorado, Utah, and more than a dozen other states all managing significant fire activity at the same time. The pool of available crews and equipment nationally has been stretched thin enough that competing fires are now genuinely competing against each other for the exact same limited resources, rather than each drawing from a comfortable surplus. This is precisely why the second half of this video's title matters as much as the acreage number itself, because officials are not describing the season as a crisis that has already peaked. Oregon's own fire managers have said directly that the state's record-breaking total was reached with roughly 2 months of typically active fire seasons still remaining on the calendar. Washington's largest uncontained fires, including Sinlahekin, remain far short of full containment, even as crews work around the clock to secure what progress they can during brief windows of cooler, calmer weather. And the same heat dome pattern responsible for compounding drought stress across the West has already shown signs of shifting rather than disappearing, with forecasters flagging renewed dangerous wind and low humidity conditions in corridors that had briefly caught a break. Exactly the kind of pattern that has driven this season's most explosive individual growth spurts so far. Historically, August and September together account for a large share of the total acreage burned in any given U.S. fire season, meaning the 5.2 million acres already on the books as of early August is very likely closer to the season's midpoint than its conclusion. That framing matters because it changes how this entire story should actually be read. A season that reaches 5 million acres in December after the full calendar year has played out is a very different situation from a season that reaches that same total before its historically busiest stretch has even begun. The first scenario describes a bad year in hindsight. The second describes a season still actively building toward whatever its final total ends up being, with the outcome still genuinely undetermined and directly dependent on exactly how the next several weeks of weather unfold across the country's most fire-stressed regions. If you live anywhere in a region currently affected by this season's fire activity, here is what is actually worth doing with this information. Do not assume a fire's current containment percentage reflects a resolved situation, since several of the season's largest fires, including some burning past 100,000 acres, remain in the single digits or low double digits for containment even after weeks of active firefighting. Check official sources directly, including the National Interagency Fire Center's situation reports and your state's wildfire portal, rather than relying on a single snapshot that may already be outdated by the time you see it. Keep a go bag packed and know your local evacuation level system in advance, since this season has repeatedly shown fires capable of moving from routine to catastrophic within a matter of hours once wind and humidity conditions align. And if you live in a region that has so far avoided major fire activity this year, do not assume that pattern will hold for the remainder of the season, since national resources are already stretched thin enough that a new, fast-moving fire anywhere in the country right now would be competing for support against more than 100 other active incidents simultaneously. It is also worth taking practical steps now if you live anywhere near fire-prone terrain, regardless of whether your specific area has been directly affected yet. Clear dry vegetation and debris away from structures well before conditions in your region deteriorate further, since defensible space meaningfully improves a structure's odds of surviving, even when firefighting resources are already stretched thin elsewhere in the country. Photograph and document your home and belongings now, storing that record somewhere other than the house itself, since insurance recovery moves considerably faster with proof already in hand. And keep an eye on your regional air quality index throughout the remainder of the season, since wildfire smoke routinely affects communities hundreds of miles from any actual fire, a hazard that has already reached far beyond the states carrying this year's largest acreage totals. The United States crossing 5 million acres burned before the traditional peak of fire season has even fully arrived is not simply a large number, it is a reflection of drought, heat, and fire activity, converging across an unusually wide stretch of the country at the same time, stretching the nation's firefighting resources thin enough to hold the highest preparedness level in the system for weeks on end. Oregon has already broken its own modern record with months of risk still ahead. Washington is still fighting to contain fires that have already produced the worst disaster in one major city's history, and officials are being direct that the numbers driving this story are very likely to keep climbing before this season is finally over. We will keep tracking this national wildfire season as new acreage totals, containment updates, and preparedness levels come in. If you want those updates the moment they land, subscribing is the way to make sure you do not miss them. And if you live anywhere currently affected by the season's fires, tell us in the comments what conditions actually look like where you are right now, because a national acreage total is easy to scroll. Past and living inside the specific fire behind that number is something else entirely, something that rarely comes through fully in a single headline number, no matter how large it gets. Stay safe, and we will see you in the next one.